Hi again, everyone. Hopefully you have done the readings and the activities related to research methods, research design, basically how we go about investigating things in the field of psychology. I just wanted to do a little mini lecture to kind of reinforce some of the important topics that you've covered. Now, I certainly won't be hitting on everything, but just wanted to go through and review a few things. So, when we're thinking about research methods, again, a research method is a systematic plan for conducting research and gathering data to support the hypothesis under investigation. Um, so let's break that down a little bit. A systematic plan. Um, so in order to come up with this plan, we really need to have a good sense of what it is that we're investigating. So in order to do that, we can think about both a theory and a hypothesis. So a theory is kind of a general explanation about how things work or how we expect them to work based upon evidence that has been collected via research. So, for example, one area that we'll talk about a little bit later in the course is conditioning, particularly operant conditioning in an attempt to change or control behavior in response to um, stimuli in the environment. So, based upon that theory, someone could then argue that, well, if someone gets a pleasurable reinforcement, they will exhibit a behavior more often. So then you could go about designing experiments in order to test that in a variety of different situations or contexts. So the hypothesis that we develop then is based upon our theory. Our hypothesis is what we think is going to happen based upon our theoretical perspective and other research that has been done. So we know that dogs can be trained pretty well using reinforcements, things like treats. A hypothesis that we may have then could be that rabbits can be trained to approach humans when a command is given. Right, so we're testing the hypothesis that if we reinforce this behavior in rabbits with a positive reinforcement, such as giving them a treat, they can be trained to exhibit this behavior. So knowing this, then we can conduct or develop rather a systematic plan to test this hypothesis. And that's really what we're trying to get at when we're talking about research methods. We have an idea, a hypothesis, something that we want to test. And so we're coming up with a systematic plan to do that. And there's a variety of different ways that we can do that. We can do it through experimental designs. We can do it through correlational designs, which you've read about. We can do it through qualitative methods, which kind of look more at the how, the what is going on in the environment. Really, the method that we select is going to depend upon the question that we want to answer. So, when we're comparing these different sorts of research methods, again, qualitative tends to be more descriptive, and really what you're trying to do with that method is try to figure out, well, what is happening in a particular situation setting. So we could do a case study. We might do naturalistic observations. So when people are studying psychological disorders, sometimes they might approach it in this way, particularly if someone is exhibiting symptoms that they aren't really sure about how to categorize, or if someone is in a situation that people normally don't find themselves in. There's been case studies on things like multiple personality disorder. Now, the problem with case studies, though, is that we're not controlling any variables. A single case may be somewhat misleading, and we'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about psychological disorders. So correlational studies are trying to detect relationships. So assess how well one variable predicts another. We can actually compute statistical associations. The thing that we need to keep in mind with these is that they do not imply cause and effect. They just imply that two variables are related. And then finally, experimental designs are really designed to try to explore cause and effect. You manipulate one or more variables. Ideally, you're only manipulating one independent variable to try to look at its impact on the dependent variable. You use random assignment to try to control for some of the other variables. The problem with this is that sometimes these studies aren't feasible, and also we need to look at how things transfer from the lab to the real world, and in the real world these types of studies aren't always able to be implemented. So really, these different kinds of research work together to help us explain different phenomena and things that are happening in our environment. So just to talk a little bit more about correlation versus causation. So correlation is research that investigates the relationship between two or more variables. So how strongly are they related, or what is the nature of their relationship? Again, experimental research is trying to look at cause and effect. So a change in one variable causes a change in another variable. So thinking about correlation then, just to give you an example, one thing that we may be interested in is the relationship between the number of books in the home and academic achievement. So this is something that comes up quite frequently. I mentioned that I studied reading. So there have been studies that have found strong correlations between the number of books in the home and academic achievement. So how well the student is doing in school, particularly with regard to reading comprehension. However, that does not imply causation, right? Because we don't know if it's the number of books in the home that are allowing students to be a better reader, or since students are better readers, do they just tend to have more books in their home, right? So that's one drawback of correlational studies. Now remember, there can be different types of correlations, and they generally, well, we always calculate them using a correlation coefficient. You'll often see this represented as R for a Pearson correlation, which is a pretty common one. Whether it's positive or negative indicates the direction of the relationship, and then the number between 0 and 1 indicates the strength of the relationship. And if a relationship is positive, it means that the two variables change in the same way. If it's negative, it means they change in opposite ways. So, for example, as one increases, the other would decrease. So we can also think about something like low self-esteem and depression. These have been found to be positively negatively correlated. So the less self-esteem someone has, there's been correlations that have been found that they exhibit a greater level of depression. But when we think about this, again, we can't imply cause and effect from looking at this relationship, because it could be that low self-esteem causes depression, it could be that depression causes low self-esteem, or it could be that there's some other factor at work, so distressing events, a biological predisposition, that's leading to both the low self-esteem and depression. So finally, just to touch a little bit on experimentation again, and to talk a little bit more about an example. So when we experiment, we manipulate something. So the manipulated or independent variable is the factor of interest, right? It's the thing that we want to test in our experiment and try to link that as a cause to our dependent variable, right? We try to control for all other factors in our experiment because we want to be able to say that these two variables exhibit a cause and effect relationship. And now there are different designs where you might have more than one dependent variable. There actually are quite a few where you have more than one independent variable, so more than one factor that you're looking at. And another neat thing that we can do is also test the relationships between these two factors as part of this design. So does an independent variable, or excuse me, does a dependent variable change differently depending on the combinations of these independent factors? So sometimes this may happen when we're doing things like looking at the effect of a different sort of treatment on different kinds of diseases or disease processes, right? You have different disease processes that you're looking at, you have different treatments that you're trying to see, does a treatment affect different disease processes in the same way, or is there a differential effect depending on both the drug and the disease process? So an example of experimentation that your book talks about is the random assignment of preterm infants. So this study used 424, so a good sample size, to either a standard formula or a donated breast milk condition. So they randomized the infants to try to control for any other variables like socioeconomic status, gender, race. What they were really interested in is did standard formula versus donated breast milk seem to impact IQ later on? And so they looked at IQ at age 8, and it revealed that those nourished with breast milk had significantly higher intelligence scores than their formula-fed counterparts. Now we can debate, about whether or not there were any issues with this study, but from a lot of perspectives, they did do a good job with randomizing, having a pretty good sample size, and trying to reduce any other variables among the infants other than whether or not they received the breast milk or the formula, right? So in this example, the independent variable is the treatment that they're in. Do they receive breast milk? Do they receive formula? The dependent variable is their intelligence score at age 8, right? Because the thing that the investigators were trying to systematically look at here was the impact of breast milk versus formula on preterm infants. And they chose this because there had been some work out there saying that perhaps breast milk was better for developing these cognitive functions at an early age. So again, we can look at the other literature out there on that. This is only one study, but they did do a nice job of setting it up in an experimental way. So just kind of a quick rundown again of some of the things related to research design. Please continue to discuss in your assignments. Send me an email or we'll continue to talk about these things in our discussion forums as well. Thank you.